Episode 8, The Prophets, God's Design Repair Team. Now, in the Old Testament, the prophets often get a bad rap. When we think of them, we tend to picture doom and gloom, fire and brimstone. But the reality is that the prophets were God's intervention specialists sent to call people back to what life was designed to be. The prophets weren't about condemning people for the sake of condemnation. They were about restoring people to life. Think about this. The Israelites, after being freed from Egypt and entering the promised land, eventually fell into patterns of idolatry, injustice, and selfish living, just like they were in Egypt. They had the land, they had the laws, but they weren't living according to God's design and God's laws. And this is where the prophets come in. They weren't fortune tellers, they were messengers of God's life-giving truth, calling the Israelites back to the heart of God's life-giving design. One of the best-known statements of the prophets is from Micah chapter 6 verse 8, where God says, I quote, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God," unquote. Now that is the essence of God's life-giving design right there. It's not about rituals or sacrifices. It's about living justly and loving mercy and walking humbly with God. But what does this look like in practical terms? Well, let's start with justice. God's justice isn't about punishing people for breaking laws. It is actually about restoring order, righting wrongs, and ensuring that everyone has a fair chance of life. The prophets spoke out against oppression, whether it was corrupt leaders, unfair treatment of the poor, or exploitation of the vulnerable. Amos famously declared in Amos 5:24 says, "But let justice roll on like a river, righteous like a never-failing stream," unquote. Now, this wasn't just a call for fairness, it's a call for a life that works for everyone, where the system isn't rigged against people. And next, the prophets call for mercy. This wasn't just a feel-good, nice gesture. It was about showing compassion, offering forgiveness, and living with a heart that reflects the love God has for us. Isaiah chapter 1 verse 17 says, and I quote, "Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow," unquote. It's about restoring relationship, in other words, and bringing people back into a community where everyone can thrive, not just survive. And finally, the prophets were there to urge the people to walk humbly with God. Now, humility isn't about thinking less of yourself. It's about thinking of yourself less. It's about putting others first and acknowledging that God's design for life is better than our own self-made plans. Isaiah chapter 29:13 says, and it reminds us, "These people come near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me," unquote. See, the prophets warned against empty rituals and reminded the people that God was more concerned with their hearts than their actions. It's about living in alignment with what God's life-giving design has for us, not just going through the motions. In the end, the message of the prophet was simple. Come back to life. Stop living in ways that break the system that God had created. Stop being selfish. Stop ignoring injustice. Stop letting pride rule your life. God's life-giving design leads to life, and the prophets were there to remind Israel, and of course to us today, that when we align with it, we experience freedom, peace, and wholeness. The prophets weren't just condemning sins. They were pointing us back to the life-giving design of God. They were showing us that the God doesn't want outward compliance. He wants our hearts and lives to be fully transformed, to reflect His love, His justice, and His mercy. So the question for us today is, are we listening to God's prophets? Are we paying attention to the way our world is veered off course from this design, from God's design? The same call the prophets gave to Israelites is still here for us today, for you and for me. It's a call to justice, to mercy, and humility. And it's a call to live in ways that aligns with God's life-giving designs. a design that brings life, not just to us, but to everyone around us. God bless.